gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first event in this year's Lit and Loose Festival. We are extremely honored to start off the festival this year with a virtual keynote from poet, editor, artist, writer extraordinaire, Anthony Cody. Today's event includes live audio translation from English to Spanish. To access the audio, please click the Zoom link in the YouTube description below. My name is Daniel Brzezinski. I am poet, translator, a professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I've been with the Lit and Loose Festival since its beginnings in 2014. This year's Lit and Loose Festival features in-person events in Chicago and virtual events such as this one, and there's lots of information on litloose.org where you can find this full schedule. So this is the 9th cycle of Lit and Loose, sponsored by Make Literary Productions, that supports the creation of new art through international collaboration and makes space for essential dialogues between residents of Mexico and the United States. This year's festival theme, Revision, re-envisioning the arts in light of the pandemic, reconsidering the canon, and revising language for the future. Today's event is also co-sponsored by UIC's newly formed Center for Latinx Literature of the Americas, which brings together writers, artists, activists, students, and the Chicago community to study, create, and celebrate new and innovative modes of literature, art, and criticism. The center is housed in the English department and the Latin American and Latino Studies department at UIC, and you can learn more about us by visiting our website as well. So there will be other virtual events this week through Lit and Loose, including tomorrow's conversation with poets Maya Marshall and Marty McConnell, and Thursday's program with Ruben Quesada, editor of the forthcoming Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry, which will include poets, contributors Cheryl Luna and Irene Lara Silva. So we are very, very honored to begin today's event and the festival with Anthony Cody. Anthony Cody is the author of Borderland Apocrypha, published by Omnidawn in 2020 and winner of the 2018 Omnidawn Open Book Prize, which was selected by poet Mei-mei Berssenbrugge. His debut collection, Borderland Apocrypha, was honored as a 2022 Whiting Award winner, a 2021 American Book Award winner, and a National Book Award finalist in poetry. It was also a 2020 Poets and Writer debut, and was a finalist at the LA Times Book Award, among many other honors, and the winner of the 2020 Southwest Book Award. He's a CantoMundo fellow from Fresno, California, with lineage in both the Bracero Program and the Dust Bowl. His poetry has appeared in many journals, including the Academy of American Poets, the Colorado Reviews, and many others. And he's the co-editor of How Do I Begin, Hmong American Literary Anthology from 2011, as well as co-editor and co-translator of Juan Felipe Herrera's Akrílica, published by Noemi Press in 2022. Anthony is also a co-publisher of Noemi Press and a poetry editor for Omnidawn, and he collaborates with Juan Felipe Herrera and the Laureate Lab Visualist Wordist Studio, and is visiting faculty in poetry at Randolph College's Low Residency MFA program. His forthcoming book is called The Reckoning, and it will be published in 2023. I've had the opportunity to read The Reckoning, Anthony's forthcoming book, which I see in the tradition of great writers like Francisco X. Alarcón and Juan Felipe Herrera, two of our most important Latinx multilingual experimentalists who have pushed the poem into new visual and mystical territories. Anthony builds on what these brilliant artists have done by creating work so singular in its vision that it is impossible to classify, so beautifully complex and miraculous as it mines the histories of migration and settlement and property and seizure. In his work, cultural and environmental devastations and displacements are indexed and mapped to shape a narrative that is personal, communal, spiritual, lexical, lyrical, translational, material, multimodal, and virtual. His work is mind-blowing art for our past and future apocalypse. Please join me in welcoming to the virtual screen, Anthony Cody.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Daniel. Honored to be here. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm here in Fresno, which is the traditional lands of the Yokuts and Mono people. I pay my respect to the ancestors of the past and those who continue to be caretakers of this land. And I ask all of you out there in the virtual sphere to also do that same acknowledgement to yourselves. Good morning for me here. It's 10 a.m. In poet time, that might be 4 a.m. or it might be, 10 at night, which is to say my sleep patterns here in the pandemic are a little all over the place. But really, one of the things in that introduction, which is both a blessing and embarrassingly long, it was wonderful to hear Daniel introduce my new forthcoming work, but more importantly, the revision that happens on the fly. To hear not someone say Bracero, but Bracero, it means a lot to me. It means a lot to my family. But with that in mind, I know when Daniel reached out, he wanted me to talk about revision. And before I do that, I'm going to do some live revision because something I need to do is also thank everyone. I want to thank all of you for being here on Halloween morning, perhaps also down in the future online, but also more importantly to the staff and the volunteers of Lit and Loose Festival to make this happen. Now 9 years running strong. Super excited to be a part of that tradition. Also, Daniel, Sarah, thank you so much. To our producer today, Elgin. Thanks for helping keep all the cats from running off. And I'm thankful to be here with all the artists, makers, writers, thinkers who'll be here in the coming days and weeks that we'll be able to hear, learn, participate with both virtually and in person. So when Daniel asked about revision, I had a whole bunch of ideas of what to talk about, where to talk about, how to talk about it. And then I thought to myself, I could give a craft talk about revision. But that might be even stranger here in this talking head sphere, where we're just kind of staring at a computer in kind of a sort of static moment. So instead, what I did is I put together a PowerPoint, thinking through, talking about all of the things in my head, which can be kind of frightening at times, but all the things in my head that were triggered by the idea of revision. So I want to kind of walk us through that. And then after that, about 20 minutes, then I'll read some poems. And then Daniel will come back here with me and we'll have a chat. And then send you along your day, wherever that may be leading. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So what I have here is variations on revision. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to keep it here in this sort of in this mode because it's just easier for me to navigate. So I can also see everything on the screen. I see people giving shout outs from all over the country. Thank you so much for joining in. Much love to you all, both here and wherever you're tuning in from across the globe. So when I thought about revision, the first thing that came to mind were a series of R's. I thought of revision as recovery. I thought of revision as something more difficult, the idea of removal. I thought about revision as realignment, as reinvention, and most importantly, I think where we're heading in this era, in a reshaping. So I think to start in recovery mode, I have to begin with my background. I am, well, like Daniel said, I have lineage in both the Bracero Program and the Dust Bowl. I'm an Irish Mexican. And for much of my time on this earth, I have always been confused and always revising, trying to understand who I am, where I come from, what that means to me. And that's always so tricky because if I enter a room, suddenly someone else revises me and I become a white man, or I enter another room and I become Mexican, and I never know when that is. But I think that's kind of critical to acknowledge for myself, being of mixed ancestry, but also being white passing, right? Like how that happens. So I'm going to start with an image here of recovery. This is a recovery image that my mother made. What you see in this picture is myself standing above my grandmother, Isabel, my brother on her lap, Joseph, and then my two cousins of German Mexican ancestry, Mary on the left, Michael on the right. We lost our grandmother right at the turn of the millennia, 1999. And sometimes we can't bring back images, moments in our life, right? They didn't happen. Things pass. We have that regret. So my mother took these two images of my cousins and revised it. She added the two of them to this photo. She was able to recover the reality that the four grandchildren of my grandmother were there together in real time, but the photo that never happened is now here in a sort of visual poem recovery, truly. And I think about this because I think it's critical for me in talking about my journey towards revision, towards writing, towards making, that I had a very fortunate childhood, an intergenerational childhood, where I was able to have those moments of joy with my grandmother, with my parents, with my family, despite having a very conflicted internal identity. On that moment there in our house, we were able to have safety. We were able to understand that the world was confusing, that things were tricky, but everything was very cocooned and safe. I did well in school. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to be, but I did well. And later on in middle school, something happened, a different kind of revision. We grew up in Southeast Fresno, which, for those of you unfamiliar with Fresno, is sort of a rough part of town. Not necessarily where the high rent district is at. This is an industrial, low income, unfortunately high crime area that we were surviving and getting along. Then one day, a highway came about here in our town, and that highway ran right in front of our yard. This photo is from that era, taken from the porch of my family's house. If my mom were to zoom in today with us and take a photo, she would see a highway off-ramp passing through. But what happened more importantly in that revision, so to speak, in a sort of hostile reinterpretation of a revision, was our neighborhood was essentially destroyed. My friends, our neighbors, the mail carrier who lived across the street, the soon to be in the future burrito conglomerate down the street also was removed and left, and instead a highway was put up. But more importantly, what it told me was I can be revised. History can revise us in a violent, hostile way. And granted, this is a very minor sort of moment where we're not entirely of the mind of being asked to leave our home. No violences are enacted against us. No harm was committed. No physical harm was committed against my family. But a very real and visceral sort of psychological revision happened. Suddenly our voices didn't matter. Suddenly people came and said, your neighborhood's going away and you're staying. And so what that sort of taught me is to internalize a lot of things. And suddenly that sort of happy childhood, that sort of happy moment in my life was quieted. And I wasn't asked to really have a participation in that choice. It just happened to me. It was very violent, very visceral. So what essentially happened in our neighborhood was little by little, it decayed. I'm going to show you about 3 or 4 slides of our neighborhood taken from this actual main street in, because it's now essentially a dead-end street, via Google Maps, funny enough. So this is the street view on Google Maps. You can see there on December 27th, a sort of blurred image taken by the car. But what you see there is a box factory, and that was a vibrant box factory, as well as behind it, a roofing company that was there for much of my childhood, that brought business, that brought many people through every day, that actually made this a very functional working community, industrial and residential. And then you see steadily a shift. Suddenly in February 2009, you see a worker, a county worker truck there, sort of observing something. And then in 2011, you see that suddenly, and it's too small to perceive there in the shadows, that there is illegal dumping happening in our neighborhood. Suddenly, people from the north, people from wherever in the city come and leave their trash. Suddenly, my worth, my understanding, the revisions already happened. No one cares about our neighborhood. People throw things there. And you see suddenly in October, it's still sort of the same moment. And then suddenly 3 years later, the building's gone. And then in 2015, things begin drying. And now 2016, 2017, 2018, again, people are here leaving their refuse in my neighborhood, in my community. And what that did for me is I began to lose my place. I didn't feel as if I mattered. I didn't feel as if anything, there was value. And that was very tricky for someone living on our street, where we do, what we live. It changed dramatically. And suddenly in school, I just wanted to be invisible. I just wanted to just sort of disappear. I didn't have any understanding of what had really happened. I didn't know words like gentrification or sort of redlining or anything like that that actually has a deep history, unfortunately, in Fresno. And then I will fast forward all the way to November 20th. You'll see again, still very dry. And then March 2022, which I think is very interesting in that these are the only 11 images, I should say, that are on Google Slide or Google Maps. There, again, you see workers cleaning, workers also now removing unhoused families and community that now have taken residence there on the off-ramp of our street. And just kind of full circle there at the bottom, the 2007 image. But what did that do for me in terms of school? And writing and creativity, I didn't have any outlets. I didn't have any moments. I just kind of went along with what I needed to do to know I had to do something different, but I had no sort of compass. What I want to think of when I think of revision as realignment, for me, poetry was that realignment in revising my own path. In my junior year of high school, I had a friend who decided not to join me in not doing the class work. He went up and decided to participate in a poetry workshop, a poetry reading and report, essentially, I should say, not a workshop. And he grabbed a book. So suddenly in this room of me being invisible, not having any sort of ideas of worth or interest, I was the only one sticking out. So I had to go up and get a book. The only book that was there was a book torn in half. And there on the screen was that I have on the left is the end of a poem. And it was the only part of the poem that I could read. And it was in Spanish. Now, keep in mind that as an Irish Mexican, I was very passively bilingual. I don't speak it fluently. The Spanish breaks in my tongue all the time, again and again and again. But what I saw in the poem that reads, "Preguntaréis por qué su poesía no nos habla del sueño, de las hojas, de los grandes volcanes de su país natal. Venir a ver la sangre por las calles, venir a ver la sangre por las calles, venir a ver la sangre por las calles." What I saw in that poem was something different. I saw an existence that I understood of what happens in the streets that I grew up on, of violence, of refuse, of being rejected and forgotten. Suddenly, poetry in that moment of revision and realignment in my life lit up. I understood that maybe poetry and life isn't something that happens to me, but maybe something that I can actively push back. I'll also read this translation. And you will ask, why doesn't his poetry speak of dreams and leaves and the great volcanoes of his native land? Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. And immediately in those moments, I understood so much about my own self. And I didn't even know who had written the poem. For many years, it was just a mystery until one of the good things about the internet, I was able to look up, come and see the blood in the streets. And there was Pablo Neruda. And I felt that very deeply, to understand that maybe I could relate to poems, that maybe something about writing and that process of making something was alive to me. But maybe I don't know if I could write a poem. And again, in another class many years later, which I know Daniel in his bio references Juan Felipe Herrera a lot. And because that is someone who's had a huge impact on my life. He and I have known each other about 2 decades now. In fact, he introduced me to this poem in a Chicanx, Latinx, Latin American arts class. He said, "Hey, you like poems, don't you? Check out this poem." And this is from the poet Andres Montoya, who also is from Fresno, the late Andres Montoya, who was from Fresno, who, like me, was of mixed ancestry. And I read that poem, and suddenly not only did I understand poetry, but I was able to recognize in that moment that I myself could also write a poem. Fresno, August 92. The brown boy lies dead, spit slipping red from his mouth in bubbles to the dry, cracked dust of the ground, sucking it up like the juice of a stepped on orange. Suddenly, I felt as if there inside the poem, the life I knew, the life I know up until that point was part of the book. Suddenly, I could, in fact, write. I could make poems. I could make poems. So there I went, making my poems, revising my journey, revising and coming through what I understood, which eventually, through a very circuitous route, I got into an MFA program many years later, finally deciding that maybe school could be for me, its very own kind of realignment revision. And there I go into a campus. I'm walking around. Why do poems feel stringent? Why do I feel collapsed? Why do I feel as if everything is collapsing on me? Why do I feel restrained by the margin? Why am I walking around like this 8.5 by 11 man's a lie, man? Don't worry about this. I hate these things. I'm telling this to people. I'm like Martin Luther walking around trying to break away from something. Leave the page. Don't worry about the page. And so there I went. I decided that maybe the page wasn't for me, that maybe the page, or maybe what we knew of the page, should be reinvented, should be liberated. And I moved away from it. I started wandering away from the margin and started thinking, why am I feeling that way? And kind of thinking through a recursive process of thinking back to the original moment in which I felt where I had been removed was there in the creation of that highway. Suddenly, the border that my grandfather crossed left and right, suddenly that border that was invented by my maternal grandmother's family, suddenly when Mexico became Arizona, suddenly I had faced that and I had repressed that same intention of another trying to keep me out. And I was beginning to bubble up and push back. Suddenly the page opened. Suddenly in that revision process, the work began to reshape. Let me go back to that presentation to kind of show you that moment here. So in that reshaping, suddenly I moved across the spine and I kept going. The poem, then I wrote my book, Borderland Apocrypha, and on a landscape across the spine, 6 inches high by 18 inches high. And I couldn't stop. I wanted to keep seeing how I can move across the page. It became a poem mural. So now I make poems that I want to project on walls, 9 feet by 27 feet. That act of revision liberated me, allowed me to reshape the page for me. Then I started thinking about our own lineage of making things on walls, of codices, and started thinking about the width. I also have poems that are feet long on scrolls. And then I thought, maybe the page is too little. Maybe what we need to do is revise to reshape the space that we exist in. And so I put them up in other spaces, in community art centers. Here you see both of the poems I just mentioned, the mural and the scroll, there in space, open to the public, open to others to see, trying to find new access points in which we can engage. Ultimately, what I want to think about is revision as a way for us to reimagine. I want to challenge us all to think through, what will you revise? What can we collectively revise? And what are the things that are no longer working? The pandemic, the carceral state, the militarization of borders, the ways in which hostility and truth are no longer not only questioned, but challenged in dangerous, complicated ways. I think we have to reimagine a world and reshape that world for us. I want to finish this keynote by a very small, simple chant that I want you to repeat after me, both aloud to yourself there in your home from your laptop, or maybe if you're there in a cafe or somewhere in the world that's busy, quietly to yourself. In the sun, I will recover. In the act, I will reinvent. In the flow, I will reimagine. Today, revision means I open. I want to thank you so much for letting me talk these 20 or so minutes with each of you. Let me meander and think through what revision can mean for me personally and be very exposed about my life and where I've taken the path to here to make poems. What I want to do now is I want to read a few poems for you. I want to think about how I've pushed that page and also taken the shapes and the forms to sort of make the things I want to see, the things I want to see on the page, abandon some of those constraints and sort of open our imagination. So let me pull that PDF up and I'll read those poems for you. All of these will be from Borderland Apocrypha. So this is the opening poem to my book, and this is me sort of revising how I would act in this moment of microaggression. I found myself in a Walgreens trying to take a passport photo, which is its own privilege. Suddenly, a white man asked me, what am I doing? Where am I running from? And this was around the 2016 lead up of the election. And so I knew what he meant, but I also didn't know what he meant. If I suddenly was too brown, or was I too white to this man? So I wrote this poem, and that really triggered the opening section of the collection. I'm gonna have a little bit of coffee. Standing in line to take a passport photo, an old white man looks at me and claims I am running. Standing here because my grandpa ran away from home to sell perfume in Ozocalo at 9. In line, I am a lot of things. And since I am a lot of things, I am everything he cannot imagine. A passport photo asks me to 2x2 myself and capture what I am in neutral. And I recall I have yet to see the chambers of my heart turn tusk. An old white man is not Gil Scott-Heron saying, because I always feel like running, not away, because there is no such place, is not how you pronounce exile or escapar. Looks at me how Teddy Roosevelt died coveting a white buffalo. Claims I am afraid. No, I am a wall. No, I am a mirror. I am still, so still. And if you notice here in the photo, in the image, each of the stanzas, so to speak, the revised, reimagined stanza, the reshaped stanza, I wanted to sort of think about all of the things that are going on in our mind in these moments. We're not here only listening to this talk. We're not here participating in this festival. We're also thinking about what we have to make for dinner, what errands we have to run, who we have to call. Maybe even have to go take a COVID test because that itch in the back of the throat's happening, right? So everything is happening to us all at once. And that's kind of what I was thinking about in this opening section too. Standing in line to take a passport photo. Oh, I went the wrong way. Standing here because my grandpa ran away from home to sell perfume in Ozocalo at 9. Standing in la caravana del hambre, agarra el sombrero. Un ángulo del hombro, fuga en la calle. Here because the static in the airwaves remains a backbone crackling in a shadow the daylight cannot remember. My grandpa ran away after his father died, followed his brother Dolores, named after childbirth, and later murdered by his grandson, who hung himself in prison, unable to await trial, a vigilance committee dangling. Away from home, the soundless gasp unpeels sky. To sell perfume, conceal the juncture, masquerade the way. Vetiver, rose hips, cedar wood, lavender, the way across is not the path into. Clove, chamomile, bergamot, the trench without space, sandalwood, palm rosa, geranium, sage, tooth and aperture underneath. En el zócalo, cucurucucú, until mother means Michoacán, then cucurucucú, leaving to cross San Isidro. At 9, trade all the pencils owned for a pocket knife at school. Etched on the handle, a Labrador growls at a pheasant. Gift this to your mother. For weeks, scraped, scavenged, led into sentences graded. A passport photo asks me to 2x2 myself and capture what I am in neutral, and I recall I have yet to see the chamber of my heart turn tusk. A passport photo should be mailed to the federal government with my birth certificate, and I wonder if they will return. Consider the power of printed paper. Asks me daily, am I brown? Am I white? Am I? I am. Am I? I am. Am I? I am. I am. I wonder when the tense transitions. 2x2 myself, a neat shape, raises no questions and tells you no lies. Capture what I am in neutral. I have yet to see a sunrise in the shadow or a child birth itself from the inside of a Joshua tree, and this does not mean it is not possible. The chamber of my heart is a quiet, the outside of a pulse driving into fire. Turn tusk, turn dusk, turn day, turn lengua, turn franca, turn español, turn sombra, así, atrás, allí, acá. To hear, yes, here, yes, here, it is dark. I want to end with 2 quick poems from the end of my book. One of them is a cura for exhaustion via mirror that suddenly in a pandemic rings so much more different. But really, it's a way that I have found to protect myself to those moments where I don't have the strength to make a revision, but simply sort of quiet and figure out where I make my next move. Tell me how many days I'm unable to remain stone. I mask how many days I am unable to remain stone. Tell me I am backward and upside down. I mask backward and upside down. Tell me about my own ways. I mask my own ways. Tell me a cathedral is not my desert bones. I mask my desert bones. Tell me my ancestors are not the astral winged. I mask the astral winged. Tell me to kindle agave prayers and swaddled ash. I mask agave prayers and swaddled ash. Tell me a canyon is not a space for me to fortress. I mask a space for me to fortress. Tell me I have no mask. I mask no mask. Tell me you don't know the shape of my grandmother's back. I mask the shape of my grandmother's back. Tell me to remove this mask. I mask this mask. Tell me I don't see you from behind the mask. I mask you from behind the mask. Tell me to forget how my grandfather's memory lives in the spine of the whip. I mask how my grandfather's memory lives in the spine of a whip. Tell me the crevice is no place to garden heartbeats. I mask no place to garden heartbeats. Tell me you do not hear the nearing echo of veins. I mask the nearing echo of veins. I gotta take a breath. And then one more poem. It's the title poem, Borderland Apocrypha. which in the context of talking about revision and the things we want to reimagine, I decided to revise and re-see how and reshape what an earthquake means to me here in California. And perhaps it can be its own sort of reckoning. Borderland Apocrypha. If your father tells you and your teacher tells you and you and the pastor at your family's church tells you to perceive breath for existing, heart for source, grave as final, voice as kingdom, and the shaking as the escape of the earth's heat, you believe the repetition, but don't. Believe that earthquakes are fed by the buried, shoulders leaning in and sinewed by the unseen, combative to covert. Recall that beneath you nothing is still. Recall that beneath you are the others. No, there is no such thing as living. Living is a birth to control you, to fear no longer being present, to fear this. Whatever your this is can leave you. The night's knuckles on the door is not consent, but a decay of the ego unheard, a nearness unknown until an apnea arrives, tearing you from bed for the noose, the blade, the bullet, the fingers forcing the larynx. You were never living. Your father will never tell you. The priest and prophet and the succulent on the windowsill will not stop you and say, you are not living. You are present. Some tomorrow there will be no sunrise, and none will say, where is, where is, where is? They will believe you are no longer. Your blood will mourn, the other will gather to publicly demonstrate. Life is proprietary. Do not listen. Join the present at the tectonic and continue to be. Push. Press your ear against the mantle to hear the sound of the pavement's rupture. Push. The city will not sleep. Push. The television and the paper will say the fault is active. Push. The scientists will diagram the earth halved to demonstrate why nothing remains static. Push. The present remain here. Push. Here. Push. Here. Push. Leave. Return. You exist. Push. You are present. Push. Swallow them into quiet. Thank you so much for being here. We're not done yet. I want to bring back Daniel, so maybe he and I can chat for a little bit, and I'll take some coffee in the meanwhile. Thank you, Daniel.
Anthony, thank you so much. Such a beautiful presentation and introduction for many people to your work and to your thinking. We have a hard stop around 1, but I have so many questions to ask you, and just thinking about, there's almost like 3 strands of ideas that you were presenting. One was a sort of like about history. One was about form, and another one was about I don't know, experimentation movement or something like that. I kind of want to ask you about all of these things, but
Yeah.
maybe just to go back to the beginning. You started us off by showing us the images of how your neighborhood had changed. You also referenced the importance of the Bracero Program to your upbringing, to who you are, to your thinking, as well as the Dust Bowl. And so I want to kind of think about questions of land, questions of movement, and questions of these kind of histories, both sort of familial ones, as well as environmental ones, as well as larger global social political ones, and maybe kind of think about how your work, how you see your work as being rooted in those ideas.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of those things, I thought in 20 minutes, how big a Pandora's box can I open and be able to close it back up, right? I think for me, it's more in the in sort of my own revelation and understanding how much these things have impacted me, and I think about that. I think because in many ways, history and form for me are sort of joined at the hip, right? Like we think so much about history as being linear, of like this happened a long time ago, blah, 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 blah. Someone found fire, blah, 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 blah. The police state was invented, blah, 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 blah. And here we are. Right. We just think of this as this linear thing, but really, I feel like it's all happening at once. To me, it's all happening in simultaneity, right? And I was thinking that through in terms of the form, especially in the opening section of how form is sort of speaking to us all at once, or history is speaking to to us all at once, right? And so I'm thinking about how all of that history and that energy, that potential, that obfuscation, the removal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is happening there in that moment. And so the energy has to go somewhere. So it kind of goes out into the page. Um, there's another part to this, so I think is important. Um, while I've been like sort of entrenched in all this work, I've started thinking about borders and sort of what borders mean in terms of like police state and like freedom to move, and thinking about like the work of the geographer Rhys Jones of sort of working on not only in border abolition, but also more importantly, what it means for us to have restriction. Like I don't think that it's an accident that we are seeing like a proliferation of experimentation, of challenging a form in a moment in history where sort of movement is definitely restricted. Bans, bathroom bills, um, pandemics, like we're being asked to like stay still. Sometimes it's for safety, sometimes it's simply to control. And so I think that there on the page is a chance, or there in poetry, there in art making, there in our imagination, is a chance for us to move, a chance for us to spread out, to explore sort of what the page means, what the field means, what the canvas means, what the what the gallery can mean, what the space can mean, what the sonic space can mean for us. So I think of all of those things sort of like part and parcel to one another. So those three strands in my head are like balled up into one. Because I don't think I could do one without the other. I don't think I would be so. I think my white passing privilege would have kept me completely ignorant in many ways to like what happened in that fence there in front of my house, there with the highway, right? Like I think my family would have liked to cocoon me and keep me safe and not think about all the things that were going awry. That there are bodies at the end of the street, the houses are being burned down, ransacked, etc. Right? And I'll stop there because I'll just open more and more boxes.
No. And to the audience, we will have a few moments for questions. So if you have some, please put them in the chat so that we can pass them along to Anthony. Anthony, it occurs to me that trying to think how to ask this question, but poets turn to like other poets as models often, but often like when one is making very innovative work as you are, it can sometimes feel as if there is not a model for what you are doing, and I think that often like can make it feel like it's hard to know like what the work is when the work is done, what its value is, and I wonder like maybe how you might think about that question of like when you're feeling like there's sort of nothing to look to as like something that looks like your work, what you do.
Yeah, it's a good question, but at the same time, I feel like there are moments, there are conversations that I feel like I've had in my life that have helped sort of Now, maybe these are one-way conversations where I go experience art or I experience the page of someone's writing, but that are able to link to. I remember, I think the kernel of Borderland Apocrypha was born in sitting in front of Writing with Death, the photo, the painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat. And I remember just being completely overwhelmed in emotion and seeing like all of his work, but also that painting in particular of where it's like a skeleton riding a skeleton towards oblivion. And I remember thinking about like the disembodied nature of all of the work, but that one specifically that I would later find out was like one of his final paintings. I think of the work of Muriel Rukeyser, Highway 1 Book of the Dead. I remember that being a very formative thing for me of thinking about what was happening. I think of Douglas Kearney. I think of even I think of even all of us. I have this like history of being like ingrained of like narrative poems from Fresno. I still have a joy in like the language that it allows me to sort of have a bit of play in the language, but also then go and push myself. Juan Felipe and I will go on little like art adventure, like art supply runs of just like what can we find and what can we play with. And I think that's incredibly helpful, my relationship and friendship with him, because here I know someone who's now in their 70s who continues to push and ask more from themselves. And I think that's really critical for me to know that while I might not have like someone exactly doing something like me, I know we're not alone out there and pushing something that's maybe creating a little discomfort, making us itchy, that we want to sort of create. And I think that's incredibly helpful to know that it's not necessarily a solitary, isolated existence. I think that's critical for me to know that. So that, and then, I think just kind of just looking at shapes. I think I'm always been visual and spatially thinking through things. So I'm always thinking about shapes. Sometimes I'm sketching out poems. Sometimes I'm sketching out shapes. Sometimes I'm just drawing. And I'm a terrible artist. Make no mistake about this. I could, if I were to draw something and say, here you go, someone would be like, well, thank you so much. I'll use the other side of this napkin to wipe my hands. So that helps. That helps to know I'm not alone doing things, but also just kind of for the sake of play, to also maybe alleviate some of that tension of maybe tackling heavier things.
Well, maybe I'll ask one more question and then we'll open it
Sure.
up. But maybe just to go back to revision, I wonder if you can like think about an example of a way in which you have just radically revised something or radically re-envisioned something that you have been working on, and how that has how that came out.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because that first poem in Borderland Apocrypha, the actual final form of that poem, which I shared, didn't happen until about 2 years after the event took place. Originally, that was like a big prose block. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was angry. I had all these feelings, and I was holding on to just existing in that way. And suddenly, in one of those art runs, I went to an art supply store and I bought a big comic strip pad that's like it's literally like 5 inches by 17 inches. And I just decided to write across the top exactly what happened. So I did. I wrote across the top exactly what happened. And suddenly I had this long, massive title and this new space that I had to understand and navigate. Suddenly the 8.5 and 11 was gone. It was obliterated, and I had to reinvent and revise and reimagine what I had to do. And so little by little through that revision process, I wandered away from that long title, and I started making these sort of like stanzas below and finding through what happened. And I think that was part of it. Even then, I would say that, backtracking a little bit before that, I was after the after being at the gallery, seeing that image, I wrote a poem. That poem was a terrible poem, but it was also a necessary poem that I wrote that became really truly the seedling of the book. A lot of the elements that I wanted to explore, a lot of things I wanted to think about, it suddenly happened and moved in that almost 8 years later after the fact of drafting that poem. So a lot of the times the revision process for me is maybe even slow. The radical revision process is years sometimes. And so sometimes that's the patience and counterintuitiveness of what, like, you know, the internet tells us is now. And sometimes the revision process is, no, dummy, take your time, crunch on it a little bit longer and see what happens. And that's like my inner thing. No, dummy, take your time.
We have a question from one of our audience members who's asking about whether the book is a project of proclaiming identity or of exploring family history and experience. And I wonder how you might address.
I think the book itself is actually a little bit more, is much more expansive than the poem, than the work I was sharing at the front and the opening of and the end of the book. Really, the book started with the idea of trying to research and figure out my own sense of understanding the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which actually is an own act of violent revisioning, is actually titled the Treaty for Friendship, Peace, Limits, and Settlement, which is definitely a much more hostile sort of vibe than the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And I remember doing that. I was thinking, I'm going to do some research on a lot of this, and what that it sort of became a reclamation of sorts, because not only was I reclaiming all the violences and traumas that were enacted against Mexican and Mexican Americans during the 1848 treaty and onward, suddenly that became a thread that kept inching forward. So when I started out, I thought I was going to be making a book of like historical poetics from like the 1850s. But as I kept researching, the realities inched forward and forward and forward until I was actually pulling epigraphs from the prior presidency's attorney general, because obviously these violences, these lynchings have only sort of been revised to be called something else. A vigilance committee is now called the Sheriff's Association. A vigilance committee is now called the police, right? And we see these horrors now enacted live. So really that exploration became sort of historical. And then as time grew on in the process and project itself, I was pulled into it because I myself now exist in this current day. And being of mixed ancestry, if I were in 1848, I understand that there's a potential for me to be both victim or oppressor, which is its own reckoning and revision of sorts, right? Of having to come to grips with that, of who and what I am now versus what I could have been in another era, right?
Well, we are just about at time. So I want to give our warmest thanks for kicking off the festival with such an amazing presentation. So thank you very much, Anthony. Please, everybody, find Anthony's previous book, Borderland Apocrypha, and the new one when it is out. I also want to thank everybody at Lit and Loose for bringing this together. In particular, our leader Sarah Dodson, who behind the scenes is making so many different things happen all week, all year, and doing so with organizational grace that goes largely unrecognized. So thank you very much, Sarah. As we said, this is a partnership between Lit and Loose and UIC's Center for Latinx Literature and the Americas. You can find the link there in the chat, I think. Thanks as well to the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, which is, of course, one of the best bookstores in Chicago. Thank you to the National Endowment for the Arts, Illinois Humanities, Vocalo, and to our many generous partners, grant makers, donors, and to everybody who is with us today and who makes this possible. So go to litloose.org For more information, come to the live magazine show on Thursday, November 3rd. Come to some of the virtual events this week or the live in-person ones. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Anthony, and have a lovely day, everyone.